The green enamel box in the boot of the F.J. Holden, the chrome trim catching the sun at Bondi, the bottle opener on the wire handle, 6 1-pint bottles, cork insulation, a 3-tray food rack, Australian summer 1952, £5 12 shillings and sixpence, made in Alexandria, named after the Eskimo, registered as a trademark in 1961, in every Australian dictionary by 1988, in every boot from Cairns to Hobart. By 1960, 500,000 Australian households owned one home in 6, the most Australian object ever invented. Then in July 2009, an American company from Wichita, Kansas, bought it from a Melbourne receiver for an undisclosed sum, killed the last thing Australia manufactured for its summer, the sheet metal apprentice who started it, the billionaire who bailed hours before the workers found out. How does Australia's most loved cooler get sold to Kansas? Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I've created a book with the complete Australian lost factories, the workers, the gates, the Australian made, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. Chapter 1. The Sheet Metal Man from Gosford, 1884. Sydney, not the American century yet, the Victorian one. Francis Malley, a native of Gosford, 90 kilometres north of Sydney, 21 years old, married the year before to Clara Merritt, opened a small sheet metal workshop in James Street, Sydney, just off Pitt Street, 2 blocks from the harbour. He made the objects that plumbers and builders bought by the crate: gutter brackets, downpipes, flashing, copper rivets pressed by hand, zinc-coated iron sheets bought in bulk from the Sydney docks. Then he made a siphon for a flushing cistern. An Australian patent, granted 1890, an improved siphon specially applicable to flushing cisterns, was Francis Malley's first legally protected invention. He was 27. 7 years later, in 1897, he patented an improvement on the whole cistern mechanism. By 1898, F. Malley and Sons was a going concern. He had 6 children by then, and every child in the family's Cremorne house on Carrila Road grew up with the smell of solder in the front room. Here's the kicker. Francis Malley had 6 children. Twin sons, Charles L. and Clyde, both born 1885, Sylvia Ville, born 1887. Garnet F., born 1892. Roy N., born 1895, and a daughter, Coral Wes. Every son would work at the factory before choosing his own path. By 1910, Francis had moved the operation from James Street to Mountain Street, Broadway, a bigger footprint, 3 stories, a stamping room on the ground floor. F. Malley and Sons Limited was formally incorporated. In 1912, Francis Malley, 49 years old at the peak of his powers as a sheet metal manufacturer, retired. He was done. He left the firm to his twin sons. He moved to Mossman, served 45 years as a Mosman Council alderman, never went back to the factory floor. And on the 26th of June, 1932, at the age of 69, Francis Malley died in Mosman. He never lived to see the Esky. Chapter 2. Sons of the Sheet Metal Man. The twin sons, Charles L. and Clyde Malley, both 27 at their father's retirement, inherited a business that had survived the 1890s depression and was about to survive the First World War. After the war ended, Charles and Clyde reincorporated F. Malley and Sons as Malley's Limited. They bought 3 acres of industrial land at Alexandria, Sydney's inner south industrial belt, a suburb of gasworks and tanneries and railway sidings. Alexandria was the place a company went when James Street had run out of room. Products: Sunrise milk cans stamped from 18-gauge Armco iron. Chip bath heaters, all-red exhaust fans, building hardware, A retail chain of Mallee's hardware stores opened from 1919, sold off in 1951 when the family decided manufacturing was the future and retail was the past. The Alexandria plant was by the mid-1920s one of the largest sheet metal factories in Australia. Mallee stamped everything a suburban household needed in metal: watering cans, buckets, chip heaters that ran on wood or kerosene, meat safes with punch-tin ventilation panels. The company advertised itself as the home of reliable metal goods. But it was the third son who mattered most for the family story arc. Garnet Francis Mallee, born 1892, enlisted with the Australian Imperial Force at the outbreak of the First World War. Transferred to the Royal Flying Corps as an observer, then a pilot. Became an ace fighter pilot with 6 aerial victories over the Western Front. Awarded the Military Cross for gallantry, then the Air Force Cross for distinguished service in the air. Returned to Australia after the war. And then, because this is the kind of family the Mallees were, Garnet spent the 1930s as an aviation advisor to Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese nationalist government. Trained Chinese fighter squadrons before the Japanese invasion of 1937. Returned to Australia in 1939 as war approached. Served in the Second World War as an intelligence officer. Read that again. The family that would invent the Esky had a fighter ace on the payroll who spent the interwar years advising the Kuomintang against the Empire of Japan. Meanwhile, Charles and Clyde ran the Alexandria factory. Meanwhile, the youngest brother, Roy N. Mallee, born 1895, had qualified as a sheet metal worker and enlisted in the Australian Flying Corps in 1916. Aviation ran in the family. Metal ran in the family. They just hadn't invented the thing that would combine both yet. Chapter 3. Ammunition Boxes and Food Containers, 1939, the Second World War. Mallees Limited, around 500 employees at the Alexandria plant, was designated a wartime supplier by the Department of Munitions. The Canberra Times, 25th of November 1966, in a company history titled The Growth of Mallees, recorded what happened next, and I quote, "During the Second World War, the company was actively engaged on war production. Food containers, ammunition racks, ammunition boxes, and a host of other urgently needed items flowed from the Mallee factories. Ammunition boxes, ammunition racks, food containers. For 6 years, the Alexandria plant made the metal that carried Australian ammunition to the Pacific and North African theatres. The stamping machines that had made Sunrise milk cans were retooled to make ammunition crates. The Armco iron that had been 18 gauge for milk was now heavier gauge, olive drab, stencilled with lot numbers. Meanwhile, 6,000 miles away, another sheet metal company was making its own war material. The Coleman Company of Wichita, Kansas, founded in 1900 by William Coffin Coleman. Lamps at first, then camp stoves. In June 1942, the United States Army Quartermaster Corps came to Wichita with a brief: design us a soldier's stove, under 5 pounds, no larger than a quart milk bottle, any fuel, operable from -60 to +125 Fahrenheit. Coleman delivered the Model 520 GI pocket stove in 60 days. The first order, 5,000 units, flew to Operation Torch in North Africa in November 1942. Over 1 million pocket stoves were manufactured by 1945. War correspondent Ernie Pyle ranked the Coleman pocket stove, and I quote, just behind the Jeep, in usefulness to the American soldier. The line appeared in Popular Mechanics, August 1945. Here's the kicker. Both companies were wartime sheet metal manufacturers. Both companies made metal boxes that helped their nations win the same war. 67 years later, one of them would buy the other. 1946. The war ended. Malleys with, as the Canberra Times put it, goodwill throughout the trade, pivoted back to consumer goods with, quote, little difficulty. They bought 11 acres at Auburn, St Heliers Road, a greenfield industrial site west of the Alexandria plant, 20 kilometres from the CBD on the Great Western Highway corridor. They were about to invent something no other Australian company had ever built. Chapter 4. £5, 12 shillings and sixpence. Summer 1952. Alexandria, Sydney. The first Esky auto box rolls off the line. Galvanised iron. Green-baked enamel exterior, chrome trim. Cork sheeting insulation between the outer and inner shells. A 3-tray food rack, removable. Room for 6 one-pint bottles standing upright. A wire carrying handle doubling as the lid clamp. A drain hole with a rubber stopper. Launch price £5, 12 shillings and sixpence. The name Esky was not new. Malleys had used Eskimo ice refrigerator for its top-of-range ice chest before the war. In 1941, a smaller version was advertised as the Esky. By 1945, Esky was the name of the flagship freestanding ice chest, 44 inches tall, 23 inches wide, 16 inches deep, holding a 23-pound block of ice. The 1952 innovation was portability. Malleys' launch advertisement in the Daily Advertiser, 24th of December 1952, read, "Take your frig to the picnic. Take your fridge to the picnic." In 1952, in an Australia where refrigerator ownership was still a status marker, the Esky was pitched as portable refrigeration for the working family. Not the wealthy. The working family, the F.J. Holden buyer, the Southern Cross tent owner, the bloke driving down to the south coast for the long weekend. The economic context mattered. In 1952, £5, 12 and 6 was roughly a third of a working man's weekly wage, but it was a one-off purchase, and Malleys built it to last a lifetime. The auto box came in one colour that first summer, green enamel, chrome trim, steel handle, cork insulation. The chrome caught the sun. The green paint matched the trim on the F.J. Holden. The whole design language was engineered for the post-war Australian dream. A car, a family, a coast, a summer. An honest note. Before we go further, no individual inventor of the Esky is named in any Malleys corporate record, any patent filing, any newspaper archive, any oral history collection. The Esky is a company invention. Charles Malley signed off on it. Clyde Malley signed off on it. Somewhere in the Alexandria drafting office, an engineer whose name did not survive drew the first cross-section of a galvanised iron box with cork insulation and a wire handle. We do not know his name. We should not pretend to. What we know is the price. What we know is the date. What we know is that in the summer of 1952, an Australian family could, for £5, 12 shillings and sixpence, put their fridge in the boot and drive. Chapter 5. The Eskimo Boy, 1959. Malleys introduces the Eskimo Boy, a smiling cartoon child in a fur-lined parka, one eye winking, as the mascot on the Esky packaging. The slogan underneath, "Cool, man, cool." The boxes were printed by Alliance Cartons Proprietary Limited of Revesby in Bankstown, Sydney's southwest industrial suburbs. Blue and white printed cardboard. The Eskimo Boy in the top left corner. The tagline in italic across the front. Take the party with you. Malleys' new look Esky. Smooth, sleek, streamlined. Then came the number that made it real, 1960. Malleys' own company figures, published in the Canberra Times, 25th of November 1966, stated that 500,000 Australian households owned an Esky. Australia in 1960 had approximately 3 million households. Read that again. 1 in every 6 Australian homes owned an Esky. 1961. The word Esky was formally registered as a trademark by Malleys Limited with the Australian Trademarks Office. Registered class, portable coolers. By 1966, the Malleys workforce had grown to 2,200. Manufacturing at Auburn and Alexandria in Sydney. Manufacturing at Woolloongabba in Brisbane through the subsidiary United Metal Industries, acquired in 1961. A white goods licensing arrangement with the Whirlpool Corporation of America. Malleys was, on paper, one of the healthiest sheet metal manufacturers in Australian history, and the green box was in every F.J. Holden boot between Sydney and Wollongong, every E.H. Holden between Adelaide and Port Augusta, every Falcon between Brisbane and the Gold Coast, every ute in every country town from Wagga to Warrnambool, every backyard barbecue in every quarter-acre block in every new outer suburb from Blacktown to Elizabeth to Doncaster. Cricket. The 1960 Boxing Day Test at the MCG. Every second spectator in the outer with an Esky between his knees. Ashes cricket. Sheffield Shield. Grade cricket in Marrickville and Randwick and Prahran. The Esky was as much a part of Australian cricket as the wooden bat and the sagging deck chair. Beach culture. Coogee, Bondi, Manly, Cronulla, Palm, the green enamel box on the sand next to the towel, 6 one-pint bottles inside, ice from the corner shop. The Esky was the working family's answer to the wealthy family's picnic hamper. The Esky had become the summer. Chapter 6. Genericide. 1965. The word Esky appears in lowercase in Australian print for the first time. 1971. First documented generic use. 1973. Malleys itself acknowledges in a company memo that Esky has entered the vernacular, that the workers on the loading dock at Auburn use the lowercase form, that newspapers use it without capitalising it, that television announcers use it without acknowledging the trademark. The Australian National Dictionary, published 1988 by Oxford University Press. Esky enna, an insulated portable container for keeping food or drink cool. The Macquarie Dictionary included it in the first edition, 1981. The Oxford English Dictionary added it in the 2004 supplement. Cultural cameos accumulated. The 1972 film The Adventures of Barry Mackenzie, Barry Humphrey's satire of the Australian abroad, features the Esky as prop and running joke. Barry Mackenzie's Esky travels from Sydney to London, carrying beer, sausages and Australian sovereignty. The Paul Hogan Show, 1973 to 1984, Hogan's character, Superdag, wields a magic Esky that produces cold beer on demand, the ultimate suburban superhero prop. The 2000 Sydney Olympics closing ceremony. Mini polystyrene Esky's handed to the crowd of 100,000 as souvenirs, national icon, front and centre in the closing images of the games broadcast to the world. The word appeared in every Australian bushfire report, every flood evacuation photograph, every backyard cricket manual. In the 1989 Canberra Times, on the 2nd of May, a story ran under the headline, Esky keeps man afloat 25 hours. A Queensland fisherman who had capsized off Rockhampton had clung to his empty Esky through the night and lived to tell the story. The green box had saved a life. Here's the thing. The company celebrated. Marketing meetings at Auburn in the mid-1970s included lines about the Esky being as Australian as a Hills hoist. Ad agencies pitched campaigns that leaned into the genericisation. The Esky, the pitch went, was a national institution. Like Vegemite, like the Hills hoist, like the Rosella tomato sauce bottle. The market share was total. The word was the product. The product was Australian summer. But here's the problem. Genericisation is a warning, not a trophy. When the trademark becomes the word, when Australians say Esky without meaning Malleys, the legal protection begins to erode. In United States trademark law, the process is called genericide. In Australian trademark law, under Sections 24 and 87 of the Trademarks Act 1995, the test is whether the mark has become generally accepted within the relevant trade as the name for the article itself. For years, Malleys had defended the trademark, cease and desist letters to competitors, trademark renewal filings through the 60s and 70s. Then, in 1984, the sheet metal era ended. The plastic Esky arrived. Polypropylene shell, polyurethane insulation, moulded in Victoria. The galvanised steel auto box, 32 years in production, was discontinued. The green enamel was gone. The word survived. Chapter 7. Nylex. Meanwhile, 600 kilometres south, 1927. John Durham, an engineer with a small plastics workshop in Mentone, a bayside suburb of Melbourne, incorporates the Australian Moulding Corporation. Rubber gaskets, Bakelite handles, small parts moulding for the automotive trade at Fisherman's Bend and Broadmeadows. Durham died in 1957. His son Peter Durham took over in 1967. The company had by then been renamed Nylex in 1948 to reflect its shift from natural rubber to synthetic polymers. 1961. Nylex erects a landmark clock and 40-metre red and yellow silos on Cremorne Street, Richmond, on the Yarra River, across from Melbourne's central business district. The Nylex clock becomes a Melbourne icon, sung about by Paul Kelly in Leaps and Bounds. Way up on high, the clock on the silo says 11 degrees. By the 1970s, Nylex is the largest plastics manufacturer in Australia. Garden hose, Bessemer tableware, water tanks, car parts, wheelie bins, rain gauges. Every suburban shed in Australia had a Nylex product in it, whether the household knew it or not. Then it starts buying brands. 1981. Nylex acquires the Malleys Esky brand. The Alexandria and Auburn sheet metal plants close within the decade. Esky production is relocated to Victoria, plastic, not steel. 1984. Nylex begins mass production of the plastic Esky at a Melbourne plant. 1989. Nylex signs a licensing agreement with the Coleman Company of Wichita, Kansas. Under the agreement, the Nylex factory in Melbourne manufactures Coleman-branded coolers for the Australian market, while Coleman gains rights to sell Esky-branded product in export markets. In 1989, the Australian company was already manufacturing Coleman product on Australian soil, and the American company was already selling Esky product overseas. The sovereignty was already leaking. Then, in the late 1980s, a new chief executive arrived at Nylex, Alan Jackson, former Reserve Bank of Australia board member, former head of BTR Nylex, the British Australian conglomerate. Aggressive acquirer, debt-fueled operator. By the late 1990s, Nylex's debts had exceeded $400 million. Profits had evaporated by 2001. By 2002, and this is the specific moment the story turns, Nylex Limited allowed the Esky trademark itself to lapse. The Australian company had stopped defending the Australian name. Chapter 8. 11 February. The 11th of February, 2009. The Nylex board meets at Cremorne Street, Richmond. Under the clock, in the shadow of the silos, the board declares the company insolvent. Voluntary administration under Section 436A of the Corporations Act. Administrators appointed George and John Lindholm of Ferrier Hodgson. Receivers appointed by secured creditors ANZ Bank and Westpac Banking Corporation. Colin Nicol, Johan Vorster and Sam Davies of McGrath. Nicol. Executive Chairman Peter George, who had joined the Nylex board in 2006, trying to save the company from Alan Jackson's balance sheet, issued a statement condemning what he called Jackson's debt-fueled spending binge. The credit crunch and the auto parts slump had finished what the leverage had started. Total debt, 100 million Australian dollars. Secured creditors owed more than 60 million. Unsecured workers' entitlements, 35 million. Around 700 workers across Nylex's Victorian operations faced redundancy. The World Socialist website, 15th of July 2009, published what happened next. Verbatim. Billionaire Kerry Stokes' Australian Capital Equity, Nylex's largest shareholder with a 19% stake, sold its entire holdings just hours before trading was suspended. Stokes netted nearly $700,000, while small shareholders were left with worthless stock. The largest shareholder, a billionaire, sold his entire holding hours before trading was suspended, netted $700,000. The workers found out on the television news. The National Union of Workers Victorian Secretary Anthony Thao addressed a rally outside ANZ Bank in Melbourne. The Textile Clothing and Footwear Union of Australia State Secretary Michelle O'Neill spoke alongside him. The workers demanded their entitlements. ANZ Bank, as secured creditor, was ahead of them in the queue. McGrath. Nickel began the fire sale, the plastics division, the garden hose division, the wheelie bin division, the car parts division, and the Esky brand, the trademark that had lapsed in 2002, the goodwill that had been built by Malleys from 1952, the word that had entered the Australian dictionary in 1988, went on the auction table. The last thing Malleys ever built was about to be sold overseas. Chapter 9. Wichita, Kansas, July 2009. The Australian Competition and Consumer Commission Informal Merger Review File, dated 2nd of July 2009, records that Coleman Brands Proprietary Limited, the Australian subsidiary of the Coleman Company of Wichita, Kansas, was proposing to acquire the Esky brand from the Nylex administrators. Coleman Company, by 2009, was itself a subsidiary of the Jardine Corporation, a consumer goods conglomerate headquartered in Rye, New York. The ACCC waived the acquisition through no competition issues. Coleman's Australian market share in portable coolers was small. Adding Esky did not create a monopoly. The 19th of July, 2009. According to Australian Associated Press, the deal completed. Coleman Australia acquired the Esky brand from Nylex's administrators for an undisclosed sum. Coleman Asia Pacific President Simon Traynor announced that the Esky, until then sold only in Australia and New Zealand, would be marketed across Asia under Coleman's global distribution network. The green box invented in Alexandria in the summer of 1952 now belonged to a company headquartered 600 kilometres from Kansas City. The Coleman Company had been founded in 1900 by William Coffin Coleman, born 21st of May, 1870. Lamp salesman, moved his business to Wichita in 1902. Elected mayor of Wichita in 1923. Founded a company that survived the Depression, built pocket stoves for the American Army in the Second World War, and grew into a Kansas industrial institution. Here's the thing. In June 1942, while Malleys Limited was stamping ammunition boxes at Alexandria, the United States Army Quartermaster Corps had commissioned Coleman to design the Model 520 GGI pocket stove. Coleman delivered in 60 days. First order, 5,000 units, delivered to Operation Torch, North Africa, November 1942. Over 1 million manufactured by the end of the war. Ernie Pyle called it, in Popular Mechanics, August 1945, and I quote, just behind the Jeep, in usefulness to the American soldier. A wartime supplier had just bought a wartime supplier, but the wars had been different. Malleys had made ammunition boxes for Australian troops. Coleman had made pocket stoves for American troops. The flags were different. The wars were the same war. And 67 years after both companies had helped defeat the Axis, the American company owned the Australian one. Chapter 10. Michael Polk. The Kansas company itself had a corporate parent, and a parent behind the parent. Coleman had been bought by Sunbeam Corporation in March 1998, under Chairman and Chief Executive Albert J. Chainsaw Al Dunlap. Sunbeam went bankrupt in 2001, emerged from Chapter 11 as American Household Incorporated, bought by Jarden Corporation in January 2005 for $845 million. Then, on the 15th of April 2016, Jarden merged with Newell Rubbermaid to form Newell Brands Incorporated. A $15.4 billion transaction, creating a $16 billion consumer goods company headquartered at 6655 Peachtree Dunwoody Road, Sandy Springs in metropolitan Atlanta, Georgia. President and Chief Executive Officer, Michael B. Polk. Cornell University, 1982, Industrial Engineering. Harvard Business School, MBA. Senior roles at Unilever from 2003 to 2011. Joined Newell Rubbermaid as CEO in July 2011. His compensation package. Base salary, $1,350,000. Total compensation, 2017, $15.3 million. Total compensation, 2018, $15.5 million. In 1 year, Michael Polk was paid more than every Malleys employee working at Alexandria in the post-war decade combined. Newell Brands under Polk was a portfolio of roll-up brands: Rubbermaid, Sharpie, Papermate, Parker Pen, Waterman, Elmer's Glue, Yankee Candle, Rawlings Baseball Equipment, Mr. Coffee, Crockpot, Coleman, Marmot, and since 2000 Esky. The strategy under Polk was consolidation, divest the peripheral brands, concentrate on what he called core outdoor and recreation. Coleman was core. Esky was core. Coleman and Esky were part of the growth plan, then it went wrong. In 2018, Newell Brands took a write-down of $8.3 billion Australian dollars. Activist investors Starboard Value and Carl Icahn moved on the board. Polk departed in June 2019, and then, in September 2023, the United States Securities and Exchange Commission finalised its findings on Michael Polk. SEC Press Release 2023-210, 29th of September 2023. SEC Enforcement Division Associate Director Mark Cave, on the record, verbatim. Today's order finds that Newell's former CEO issued an instruction to scrub the company's accruals after he learnt that the company was projecting a massive and disappointing miss for the quarter. Scrub the company's accruals. Newell Brands fined $12.5 million. Michael Polk fined personally $110,000. Neither admitted wrongdoing. The company that owned the Esky, the chief executive who owned the company, and the SEC settlement that owned the chief executive. Chapter 11. Where the Green Boxes Went. 2026. Walk through the streets where Malleys was made. James Street, Sydney. Francis Malleys' first workshop, 1884. No plaque. Commercial and office space now. The building next door houses a marketing agency. Around the corner, a coffee shop where a flat white costs more than the first Esky auto box did in 1952. Mountain Street, Broadway, F. Malley and Sons Limited, 1910. No plaque. Absorbed into the University of Technology Sydney campus. Students walk past every day. None of them know what was made there. The Alexandria site, 3 acres. Once the heart of Australia's sheet metal industry. Inner South Sydney, industrial residential. Warehouses and light industrial units, some still working, most converted to office space. No plaque. The Auburn site, 11 acres. St Heliers Road, in Cumberland Council Territory. Warehouses, distribution centres. No plaque for Malleys Limited, 600 kilometres south. Cremen Street, Richmond. The Nylex clock, heritage listed, restored in 2021, still lit at night, still telling Melbourne the time and temperature. But the factory below it closed since 2009. What lies inside the silos is not what filled them. Esky-branded coolers are now manufactured in China. Coleman's US market coolers come out of Wichita, Kansas, and New Braunfels, Texas. The dividends fly to Sandy Springs, Georgia, where the green enamel originals survive. The Yarela Arts and Museum in Coffs Harbour holds a leaf green 1950s Esky, accession number 16-398. Galvanised metal lining, rubber seal, 2 side handles, 2 front catches, painted leaf green. The closest surviving match to the original 1952 auto box. The Queensland Museum in Brisbane holds an early Malleys Esky, catalogue number H43111.1. Blue metal box, white lid, internal metal dish, 1950s. The Powerhouse Museum in Sydney holds Malleys Esky, Object 354260, a 1966 to 1969 brown model in its original Alliance Cartons box, printed by the Revesby Cardboard Factory in Bankstown. Used by the Partridge family on trips from Maxville to Sydney. The box is lined with newspaper dated January 1970. Donated by Lachlan Partridge. No plaque for Malleys, no plaque for Alexandria, no plaque for Auburn, no plaque for the ammunition boxes and food containers that flowed from the Mallee factories in the Second World War, no plaque for the 500,000 Australian households in 1960, no plaque for the 700 workers who lost their jobs in Victoria in February 2009. On any Sunday, on any Australian beach, on any highway from Sydney to the south coast, the green box is still there. Second hand, family heirloom, passed down from a grandfather who bought his first Esky in 1958 at a Malleys hardware store in Woolloongabba for £5.12 and 6. The word is still there. In the dictionary, in the vernacular, in the boot of every ute from Cairns to Hobart. But every Esky sold new in Australia today is manufactured offshore, imported by a Wichita subsidiary of an Atlanta parent. The profits fly to Sandy Springs, Georgia. The green box survives. The country that made it does not. Lesson 1. Genericisation is a warning, not a trophy. When the trademark becomes the word, the company has already lost. Malleys celebrated when Australians started saying Esky without the capital E. The Macquarie Dictionary put it in. The Australian National Dictionary put it in 1988. The marketers at Auburn called it national iconography. But by 2002, the same year the dictionary editors were still cataloguing Esky as an Australian icon, Nylex had let the trademark lapse. Failed to renew. Failed to defend. The word had eaten the brand. When Coleman Australia came knocking in July 2009 with an offer for the Nylex administrators, there was no trademark to defend, only a factory in receivership and a word that belonged to everybody. When Australians started saying Esky for any brand of portable cooler, the Australian company that invented it had already begun to die. It took 28 more years and Alan Jackson's $400 million in debt to finish the job. But the word ate the brand first. Every Australian icon in the dictionary is a Malleys waiting to happen. Lesson 2. Debt-fueled conglomerates don't preserve national brands. Alan Jackson turned Nylex from an Australian plastics champion into a $400 million debt pile. The National Union of Workers and the Textile Clothing and Footwear Union rallied outside ANZ Bank in July 2009. Anthony Thau spoke. Michelle O'Neill spoke. 700 workers demanded their entitlements. The banks did not blink. Kerry Stokes' Australian Capital Equity sold 19% of Nylex hours before trading was suspended. Stokes made $700,000. Small shareholders got zero. The workers got the $35 million in entitlements queued behind $60 million in secured bank debt. The Esky brand was auctioned to the highest foreign bidder. Coleman Australia won. The Australian company had to be broken before the Australian brand could be sold. And when it broke, the billionaire on the share register got out at the top. And the workers got a rally outside a bank. Debt is not neutral. Conglomerate roll-ups are not neutral. When a financial engineer buys a manufacturing champion and loads it with debt, the exit is preordained. The workers pay. The shareholders sell. The brand goes overseas. It has been the pattern since Chainsaw Al Dunlap bought Sunbeam. It will be the pattern after Michael Polk. Nylex under John Durham in the 1930s made rubber gaskets for Australian cars in a Melbourne workshop. Nylex under Peter Durham in the 1970s made every second garden hose in Australia. Nylex under Alan Jackson in the 1990s was a debt vehicle wearing a manufacturing costume. Same name. Same clock on Cremorne Street. Different animal. The Esky was the collateral damage, not the target, never the target. Alan Jackson never woke up in 1998 and decided to kill the Esky. He decided to leverage the balance sheet. The Esky died because it was on the balance sheet. That is the point. Lesson 3. The green box survives. The country that made it does not. The Yarrilla Museum in Coffs Harbour still holds the leaf green 1950s Esky, accession 16398. The Queensland Museum still holds Mallee's H43111.1. The Powerhouse Museum still holds the Partridge family's 1966 brown Esky in the original Alliance cartons box. The word is still in the dictionary. The green colour is still on every Bunnings shelf. The summer is still there. But every Esky sold new in Australia today is manufactured offshore. The trademark sits in a filing cabinet in Sandy Springs, Georgia. The profits fly north. The country that invented the portable cooler can no longer make one. Francis Malley opened a sheet metal shop in James Street, Sydney in 1884. His sons built a factory that helped defeat the Axis in the Second World War. His grandsons, Charles's boys and Clyde's boys, working at Auburn in the 1960s, watched 500,000 Australian households own the object their grandfather's family had invented. Their great-grandsons watched it get sold to Kansas for an undisclosed sum in July 2009. The Malley family arc took 4 generations and 125 years. From a Sydney workshop in 1884 to a Melbourne receivership in 2009. 4 generations of Australian manufacturing, 1 boardroom auction, and the trademark went to a Wichita subsidiary of an Atlanta parent. The green box survives as a museum piece. The word survives as a common noun. The summer survives on every Australian beach, but the sovereignty is gone. Somewhere in a shed on the New South Wales Central Coast, not far from Gosford, where Francis Malley had learned the sheet metal trade in the 1880s. A grandfather's original green enamel auto box sits under a workbench. The chrome trim scratched, the wire handle slightly bent, the rubber drain plug missing, but the paint still green and the cork still holding the cold. Every summer, his grandsons pull it out, put it in the boot, drive to the beach. The Esky still works. The country that made it does not. £5, 12 shillings and 6pence. Invented in Alexandria, sold in Kansas. The word is still ours. The company that owns it is not.